11:42 a.m., October 12, 1944, over eastern France, 25,000 feet above a layer of broken white cloud. The air vibrated with the deep metallic hum of P-51 Merlin engines pushing hard against the cold autumn sky. The oxygen mask pressed against Chuck Yeager's face, its rubber scent mixing with dry, freezing air leaking through the cockpit seams. His gloved hand rested on the throttle, feeling every tremor of the engine as the Mustang sliced through thin wisps of cloud. Sunlight flashed across the canopy, glinting off scratches earned in earlier missions. Below him stretched a battlefield hidden under silence, while above, the sky carried the tension of a place where 1 second of inattention could end everything. He scanned the horizon. Even through the distortion of the canopy, his eyes were sharp, trained by months of combat. The air felt unsettled. The light was too bright, the winds too calm, the distant haze too still, conditions that made ambushes easy. And Yeager, now one of the most experienced pilots in the 357th Fighter Group, knew German tactics well enough to sense when something wasn't right. The tang of pure oxygen filled his lungs as he inhaled slowly, watching contrails form and vanish in the bright cold air. The Mustang fleet around him cruised with disciplined spacing, each pilot alert, knowing the Luftwaffe still fought with fierce desperation. The German FW-190s and Bf-109s had grown more aggressive in recent months, launching slashing attacks on American escorts, hoping to pick off stragglers or hit bombers making their turns home. Yeager had seen friends vanish in those sudden attacks. He'd seen aircraft fall burning through the clouds. He'd watched pilots he admired disappear without a trace in the silent sky. Those memories always lingered behind each mission, turning the quiet moments into something heavier. Today was no exception. The 357th had finished escort duty for a raid deeper into Germany and was now heading west, back across occupied territory. This part of the flight, the return, when fuel ran low and altitude dropped, was when German fighters most often struck. Yeager adjusted his trim slightly, feeling the P-51 respond through the subtle vibration in the stick. The Mustang felt light, eager, a machine that seemed alive in his hands. Its Rolls-Royce-designed Merlin engine delivered a steady, confident rumble. In level flight, the cockpit shook with a deep, rhythmic vibration that Yeager always found reassuring. At 25,000 feet, the air was so thin that each movement of the control surfaces felt delayed, almost disconnected. Yet Yeager trusted his aircraft. He knew how far he could push it and how easily it could kill a pilot who made the slightest mistake. He had learned that lesson not only from training manuals and engineering briefings, but from the enemy and from the war itself. The Mustang was fast, maneuverable, and deadly, but it also had limitations. Dive too steeply, too fast, too long, and the airframe entered compressibility, the mysterious region near the speed of sound where airflow changed, controls locked, and pilots were at the mercy of physics. For months, Allied engineers had warned pilots not to push the Mustang beyond safe limits in a dive. But combat didn't care about limits. When the Luftwaffe came for you, sometimes your only escape was straight down. Yeager kept his eyes moving. His canopy was spotless, he cleaned it himself before every mission, knowing one small smudge could hide the glint of an enemy fighter. The wind hissed along the fuselage. The Merlin's pitch altered slightly as he nudged the throttle, a smooth metallic growl filling the bubble canopy. Then he saw it. A faint speck. 2. Then more. Dark dots emerging at the edge of visibility, high off his right, sun behind, moving fast. Yeager stiffened. German attack position. He blinked, steadying his breathing. He didn't turn sharply, not yet, but shifted his Mustang just enough to change his angle and reduce glare from the sun. The specks grew clearer. Their silhouettes sharpened. FW-190s. Their wide, angular wings gave them away first. Then the rising sun shimmer of their canopies. Then the glint of wing-mounted cannons. They were diving in a loose formation, not committed yet, but closing. Watching. Testing. A cold pulse ran through Yeager's body. He tapped his radio switch. "Keep your eyes open," he said calmly, pretending his heart wasn't hammering. "We've got movement high at 3 o'clock. His voice stayed even. He always sounded calm and danger, something his squadron mates often joked about. But no one understood better than Yeager that panic killed pilots faster than bullets. The FW-190s continued edging in, tracking the American formation. They weren't diving yet, but their moment was coming. Yeager looked around. The rest of the Mustangs maintained position, but they were spread wider than he liked. Too much distance. Too much space for Germans to exploit. And then, the moment every pilot dreaded, separation. Yeager checked his fuel. Checked his altitude. Checked his throttle. One of the FW-190s peeled slightly downward, testing angles. Another adjusted position to box in a potential escape route. Yeager's instincts sharpened. He recognized the maneuver. They're setting up for a bounce. He breathed deeply. Slow. Controlled. The sun flashed in the canopy again. It felt too bright. Too hot. His gloves felt suddenly damp. He had seconds, maybe less, before those German fighters committed to their dive. They were above him, with altitude advantage, the most dangerous position in aerial combat. From there, the FW-190 could convert height into devastating speed. And Yeager knew from experience, the 190 hit like a hammer in a diving attack. His hand tightened on the stick. The leather of his gloves creaked. The air inside the cockpit felt thinner. If the Germans chose him, if they singled out the Mustang drifting slightly lower than the rest, he would have no choice but to dive. And dive hard. But how hard? How fast? Yeager knew the Mustang handled beautifully, until it didn't. Beyond a certain point, airflow at high speed made the control surfaces freeze. Compressibility. The dead zone. Pilots who fell into it rarely came back. He'd heard the stories. P-38 pilots who lost elevators. P-47 wings that fluttered dangerously. Even the sleek Mustang wasn't immune. Engineers had warned, if the controls locked up, the only way out was luck, altitude, or structural failure. But the FW-190s were close now, too close. One of them rolled slightly, nose dipping, committing to the beginning of an attack dive. The others mirrored the motion. A coordinated opening move. Yeager's heartbeat thudded in his ears over the oxygen hiss. This was it. He took one more breath, steady as stone, and pushed the stick forward. Not too hard. Not yet. Just enough to build separation. Enough to set up for what he knew he might have to do, escape by raw speed. The Mustang tilted, nose lowering toward the endless white cloud deck below. The FW-190s followed. The wind rushed louder against the canopy. The P-51's vibration deepened. Altitude fell. The cold air sharpened. Yeager felt the first wave of speed as the dive angle increased. The Mustang's Merlin engine screamed with rising pitch. His body pressed against the restraints, the pressure tightening against his chest. The Germans accelerated behind him. He could not see them yet, but he felt them, the way a hunted animal senses the predator closing in behind. The dive steepened. The P-51's airframe moaned. The wind roared like tearing canvas. And Yeager knew the danger ahead, the mysterious edge of compressibility, where airflow no longer behaved, where the Mustang's soul could turn from responsive to silent. He tightened his grip. The stick trembled faintly as speed climbed. Would the controls freeze? Would the wings hold? Would the airframe hold together? He pushed the nose down a little more, just enough to gain the seconds he needed, the space he needed, the speed he needed. Behind him, the FW-190s vanished into the blinding light, hidden but closing, turning their altitude advantage into lethal momentum. The P-51's dive steepened further. The world compressed into vibration, pressure, noise, cold, and light. And Yeager's real test, the one engineers had warned every pilot about, was about to begin. The wind hammered violently against the P-51's canopy as Chuck Yeager's Mustang knifed downward through the bright, thin air. The dive angle sharpened with every passing second, and a deep vibration traveled through the fuselage into the stick, up his arms, and into his shoulders. He kept his breathing steady, but the pressure building across his chest made each inhale feel a little tighter, a little more strained. The altimeter needle spun downward, ticking rapidly like a clock running out of time. Behind him, out of view, the FW-190s continued their descent, silent, invisible, but deadly in their approach. Yeager knew their tactics. German pilots preferred coordinated high-side attacks, rolling inverted and diving in unison to overwhelm a target before the American formation could react. The FW-190, with its broad wings and powerful BMW radial engine, was a brute in the dive. It held energy well and could strike with crushing force. The Mustang was faster in level flight, but in a straight dive, the 190 closed the gap quickly, at least until the airflow began reaching transonic levels where the German fighter struggled. But those limits lay farther down the dive, and Yeager had learned long ago, you never relied on your opponent hitting their limit first. He felt the Mustang's nose tremble. A thin whine crept into the structure. The control stick grew heavier. He pushed a little more throttle, not because he needed engine power in the dive, gravity was doing the work now, but to keep the Merlin spinning at a speed that allowed him to pull out cleanly once the moment came. The world narrowed into a tunnel of rushing light and roaring wind. A thin layer of cloud rushed upward toward him, swirling like a white ocean rising from below. For a few seconds, there was no sky, just motion, noise, and the raw sensation of speed. His goggles vibrated against the mask. The edges of his vision quivered from turbulence. The slipstream screamed like tearing metal. He checked his airspeed. The needle climbed past 500 miles per hour, the threshold where the Mustang approached the unknown. Allied test pilots had warned that anything beyond this point risked compressibility, a phenomenon few pilots survived. Airflow over the wings changed. Control surfaces locked. Elevator response vanished. Sometimes even the trim froze. The aircraft became a projectile with no authority, plunging uncontrollably until either drag slowed it or it broke apart. Yeager's mind raced calmly through the danger. What altitude was left? How close were the Germans? Would they follow the steep? He knew they wouldn't follow forever. German pilots feared compressibility too, especially in heavy, high-altitude dives. The FW-190 had a reputation for shaking violently as it neared transonic zones. Some pilots described momentary blackout-like flickers in their eyes as the pressure rippled through the cockpit. They could pursue, but only to the line where instinct overruled aggression. The cloud layer loomed larger. Shadows twisted across its surface. He braced. As the Mustang punctured the cloud, the cockpit dimmed into gray. Moisture streaked across his canopy. For a moment, everything blurred, and Yeager flew blind, trusting speed, angle, and instinct, the three elements that had saved him more than once. The temperature dropped sharply. His breath frosted the edges of the mask. His gloves stiffened. The control stick felt like iron. Then the Mustang burst out beneath the cloud deck into clearer sky, and light returned in a violent flash. Yeager felt it immediately. The stick shuddered, then stiffened. His stomach dropped. This was the edge of compressibility. It was the place where airflow no longer obeyed engineering logic, where tail surfaces lost effectiveness, where elevators became slabs of frozen metal. He tried to ease back on the stick. No response. He tried again, lighter this time, keeping his touch as gentle as possible. Still nothing. The Mustang continued accelerating downhill, its nose locked in a shallow but deadly steep line toward the earth. The airframe shivered with low, oscillating vibrations that traveled up his spine. He checked altitude again. He was losing thousands of feet every second. A pilot who panicked would die here. Many had. Yeager remembered hearing about Clarence Bud Anderson's warnings: never fight the aircraft. Never jerk the stick. If compressibility locked controls, subtlety and patience were the only tools a pilot had. During a briefing months earlier, a test engineer had told them that as airflow thickened at lower altitude, the control surfaces might slowly regain authority, but only if the pilot avoided ripping the aircraft apart in the process. Yeager steadied himself, exhaled slowly, and held the stick gently, not forcing it. He watched the cloud shadows race across the ground. He felt the rising pressure along his ribs as gravity increased, the seat straps biting into his shoulders. And slowly, painfully slowly, the air thickened. The vibrations changed pitch. A faint hint of control returned.
He eased the stick again.
This time, the Mustang whispered back with a barely noticeable response.
Just a hair.
But he felt it. And that sensation, the tiny flicker of authority, ignited hope in his chest. He held it there, steady, patient. The wings trembled as the airflow shifted from chaotic compression to smoother, denser layers. The Mustang resisted, then slowly began to lift its nose. Not much, but enough to angle the dive into something survivable.
A soft groan echoed through the airframe as the G-forces increased. Yeager's vision tightened slightly.
His body compressed into the seat. The straps dug deeper.
But the nose came up.
The worst had passed.
He checked behind him.
The trailing FW-190s had broken off. They had not dared follow him into the deepest part of the dive. Their silhouettes were dots again, distant and harmless, returning upward toward safer altitudes. He felt his heartbeat slow, though adrenaline still flooded his blood.
The Mustang's wings flexed lightly in the recovery.
The world steadied. The wind softened from a scream to a roar, then to a manageable vibration. He leveled out across the low broken cloud deck, rolling calmly into a shallow climb. The Merlin's sound returned to a purer tone, no longer fighting the chaos of compressibility. His breathing normalized.
He was alive. After a few moments, the radio crackled.
"You all right down there, Yeager?" A voice came through. One of his squadron mates who had watched the dive, heard the tension in his voice, and feared the worst. Yeager switched his mic and spoke with that same calm tone that masked the shaking in his arms.
"Yeah," he said.
"Had to take it down a little fast. But she held." He didn't mention how close it had been. He didn't describe the frozen controls, the trembling wings, the way the world had narrowed into a single question: would the Mustang respond before the ground arrived? Pilots seldom discussed those moments until long after the war. Not because they weren't important, but because speaking them aloud made the danger real, made the fear harder to hide. Yeager knew that engineering teams back in England were studying compressibility, running wind tunnel tests, collecting data from returning pilots. They were trying to understand the boundary between safe operation and lethal speed. Their knowledge grew each month, but it all hinged on real experiences like this, moments when pilots pushed machines past the limits printed in manuals. He flew steadily west, watching his fuel levels, engine temperatures, and manifold pressure. The Mustang purred along smoothly now, as if nothing had happened. That was one of the remarkable qualities of the P-51, it took punishment, absorbed stress, and still carried its pilot home. Naval aviators often said that aircraft had personalities. Yeager believed the Mustang had courage. As he climbed back toward friendly airspace, the sky around him grew calmer. The earlier tension of the sortie faded into the hum of routine flight. His squadron reformed in the distance, confident now that no German fighters remained nearby. The sun dipped slightly, turning the cloud tops gold. A sense of reflection settled over him. He thought about the strange mix of youth and responsibility carried by every fighter pilot, men barely out of their teens making decisions in seconds that determined whether they lived or died. He thought about how few people understood what those moments felt like: the pressure, the noise, the cold, the isolation. And he thought about how close the war had taken him to the edge, not just the enemy, but science itself. Compressibility was not a myth or a theory. It was real, invisible, and lethal. And today, it had nearly claimed him. He shook his head, smiling faintly behind the mask. Surviving such moments didn't make a pilot fearless. It made him respect the sky even more. Back at base, when he finally landed, ground crew ran to inspect the Mustang. The skin of the wings bore faint ripples, slight, almost invisible distortions caused by the enormous pressure of high-speed airflow. Mechanics studied them with a mix of concern and fascination. The Mustang had been tested, and it had held. Pilots gathered around, curious and wide-eyed, asking what had happened. Yeager shrugged it off with characteristic simplicity. "Dove her a little too hard," he said. But she came back. What he didn't say was that the experience marked him deeply. It taught him that speed, true speed, was both salvation and danger. It revealed the thin line between control and chaos, between engineering assumptions and real-world physics. Years later, when Yeager broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1, he would remember this moment: the trembling wings, the frozen controls, the invisible wall of air that resisted all logic. But on that October day in 1944, he was still a young pilot in a war that demanded courage every hour, every mission. He climbed back into formation, the Mustang gleaming faintly under the sun. The sky ahead stretched calm and bright, carrying no hint of the violence it had held minutes earlier. Yet the lesson of the dive remained with him: speed could save a pilot, but only if he respected the limits nature imposed. The Germans had broken away. The Mustang had survived compressibility. And Yeager, once again, had walked the edge of the unknown and come back with a story that would echo through aviation history. The horizon opened wide and quiet ahead of Chuck Yeager as his Mustang climbed steadily, but the calm was deceptive. The air still carried the tremor of the dive, and his hands, though steady on the controls, hadn't fully forgotten the violence of those last minutes. His breath settled into a deeper rhythm as he eased the P-51 toward safer altitude, letting the Merlin's warm growl fill the cockpit. The sound was comforting now, a reminder that the machine beneath him wasn't just metal and rivets. It was a partner that had carried him through one of the most dangerous moments a World War II pilot could face. He scanned the sky behind him one last time. Nothing. No flicker of gray wings. No sunglint hinting at another ambush. Just empty sky, vast and clean. The kind of sky a man didn't appreciate until he'd felt death gaining on him at 500 miles per hour. The mission continued like any other, the squadron reforming slowly as they pushed west. But for Yeager, the world around him felt sharper, the colors more saturated, the sunlight brighter, every cloud edge razor-defined. Surviving a compressibility dive was like returning from a place few men had ever seen. Everything afterward carried a strange, fragile clarity. He leveled off near 10,000 feet, the Mustang slicing into friendlier air. The world below softened, rolling fields, roads weaving like threads, small villages in the distance that had endured the relentless push of the war. The wind against the canopy eased into a gentler rustle. For a moment, it felt almost peaceful. But war never let a pilot enjoy calm for long. Radio chatter rose again, scattered voices across the squadron, checking in, confirming positions. Each voice carried that subtle tremor, the lingering edge of adrenaline. They all knew how narrow the line between life and death could be in the sky. They had watched Yeager's dive. Even if they didn't know the details, they understood the risk. They understood how close he had come to a place that no training manual could fully prepare a man for. Yeager kept his tone flat, steady, almost uninterested, the same way he spoke when landing, when eating breakfast, when discussing tactics. He always hid the fear well. But he also knew something that would stay with him for the rest of his flying life. Speed was not just a number. Speed was a force, one that pilots had to respect, even fear. He eased the Mustang into cruise, letting the engine cool a little. The cockpit smelled faintly of oil and metal warmed by sunlight. His oxygen mask hissed softly with each breath. It was all familiar, but beneath the familiarity lay a new layer, a quiet understanding that this aircraft, as perfect as it felt, had nearly slipped beyond his control. Moments like that changed a man. As the squadron crossed back over Allied territory, tension eased. The radio turned calmer. Conversations trickled into relaxed remarks. Ground control crackled through with weather updates and landing instructions. The chaos of combat faded behind them like a storm dissolving into memory. But inside Yeager's mind, the dive replayed in fragments. The needle racing past 500 miles per hour. The stick freezing hard as steel. The Mustang trembling on the edge of physics. The moment when he wasn't sure if the aircraft would ever respond again. Those details sank deep into him, carving a quiet mark. When he touched down at Leiston, the Mustang's wheels chirped against the runway, and the vibration through the fuselage felt reassuringly normal. Ground crew rushed up quickly, eager to get a first look at the aircraft that had just pushed the edge of known limits. They checked the wings, running hands along the metal, searching for signs of stress. The ripples they found, faint but unmistakable, told the story better than Yeager ever could. Engineers would later examine the data and confirm what many already suspected: the P-51D could approach transonic speeds in a dive, but only with a skilled pilot and a measure of luck.
The elevator issues Yeager faced were real, documented, and deadly. His recovery wasn't guaranteed by design, it came only because the aircraft passed into denser air exactly when it needed to. Other pilots weren't always so fortunate. Inside the squadron briefing room, the debriefing was short. Yeager described the dive with simple clarity. No drama. No embellishment. He focused on airspeed, angle, control response, recovery altitude data that engineers needed. He spoke as if recounting a weather observation. But the men listening knew better. They knew he had just danced with the limits of aerodynamics. His commanding officer studied him for a long moment, recognizing that Yeager had not only survived but learned something invaluable. Knowledge like that earned at 25,000 feet under pursuit from enemy fighters couldn't be taught in classrooms. When the briefing ended, pilots drifted out quietly. A few clapped him on the shoulder. One joked about Yeager trying to outrun the sound barrier years too early. Yeager just smirked, though years later the irony of that remark would echo in history. That night, the sky outside the barracks stretched black and silent. A few stray artillery flashes flickered far across the horizon, distant reminders of a war still raging. Yeager sat on his bunk, running a cloth along his flying goggles, polishing away the thin layer of frost that had formed during the dive. He thought about the FW-190 pilots who had broken away. He wondered what they had seen: a Mustang plunging down into the clouds at impossible speed, vanishing like a stone into a lake. Perhaps they believed he had been lost. Perhaps they thought no man could survive such a dive. He wondered if anyone on the German side spoke later of the American who fell too fast to chase, just as American pilots spoke of German aircraft performing impossible maneuvers. History was full of these small, silent intersections, moments where two sides brushed close, each too busy surviving to understand the story being written. As the base settled into nighttime quiet, a cold wind swept across the airfield. The parked Mustangs gleamed faintly under thin moonlight, their silhouettes sharp and powerful. The war had shaped them into symbols, not just machines, but instruments of survival, ambition, and sacrifice. And Yeager knew something even then, something he would later describe in his memoirs: war had introduced him to the limits of the sky long before peace ever let him challenge them deliberately. During World War II, pilots learned by pushing machines until they broke. They discovered compressibility by flirting with death. They uncovered aerodynamic mysteries by accident, under fire, while making split-second decisions. What Yeager learned that day, how airflow behaved when the Mustang fell toward transonic territory, would become part of the foundation for his later achievements. The war taught him courage. It taught him instinct. It taught him respect for speed. And years later, when he climbed into the Orange Bell X-1, listening to its rocket chamber crackle and groan, he carried with him every ounce of knowledge earned during that October dive. He knew what it felt like when controls froze. He knew what it meant to trust physics when fear came rushing in. He knew how to stay calm when the world narrowed to vibration and breath. That day in 1944 didn't make him unbreakable, it made him understand the sky. And understanding it was what allowed him to conquer it. As the documentary closes, the audience is left with a quiet truth echoing in the final footage: Yeager's 3-minute escape from 6 FW-190s wasn't just a wartime story. It was a chapter in humanity's climb toward better engineering, deeper knowledge, and a future where pilots would finally master the invisible forces that once hunted them. It reminds us that progress is built on risk. That courage is not loud, but calm. That survival in the sky depends on respect as much as skill. And as viewers reflect on that long-ago dive, the trembling wings, the frozen controls, the young pilot holding steady on the edge of the unknown, they may find themselves wondering what other secrets of the sky were learned the same way, not in laboratories, but in the thin cold air of combat. Some stories leave technical lessons. Some leave emotional scars. This one leaves both. And perhaps that's why, decades later, people still talk about Chuck Yeager's dive, not because it was the fastest, or the longest, or the most dramatic, but because it captured the moment a young pilot met the edge of science, and lived to teach the world what he found there. If you feel connected to this moment, if it sparked a memory, a question, or a thought, let it live here. In the comments, share what part of Yeager's story struck you the most. Stories like this survive because they're remembered. And remembered because they still matter.